Hi everybody, welcome to Seattle's Civil War Legacy once again. Today we are coming from Seattle's Grand Army of the Republic Cemetery, and we are here to talk about Lieutenant Justus O. Rockwell of the 97th New York, Company E. Justus Rockwell served as a lieutenant in the 97th from early on in the war. He helped form Company E. In fact, he personally mustered about 40 men that he would take off to become part of the 97th New York. From New York, they went south to Washington, D.C., where they spent time in the defenses of Washington. They then moved out into Virginia, where they would see action at 2nd Manassas. They would see severe action in the cornfield, the famous and deadly cornfield at Antietam. They would then go on to fight at Fredericksburg. Lieutenant Rockwell was wounded in the shoulder slightly, fighting with the 1st Corps on the Slaughter Farm, what is now known as the Slaughter Farm area of the Fredericksburg battlefield. He would recover from that wound, participate in the fighting at Chancellorsville. Most notably, he would then fight at Gettysburg. The 97th New York was a 1st Corps regiment. They fought on Oak Ridge on the early afternoon of July 1st, 1863. The 97th is most known for the destruction of Iverson's North Carolinians on Oak Ridge on July 1st. Later on July 1st, Justus Rockwell would become one of a large number of Union prisoners of the 1st and 11th Corps as Confederate troops surrounded and drove the 1st and 11th Corps off of that hill and through town. Justus would join the significant number of Union officers that were captured that in the first day's fighting at Gettysburg that were shipped south after the battle to be imprisoned. And that started for him with all the other Union officers at Libby Prison in Virginia. Lieutenant Rockwell would serve an extraordinarily long term of imprisonment. Even among any Union soldiers from any theater of war, he spent 20 months in imprisonment in an assortment of rebel prisons, not just Libby. He served in 9 different Confederate prisons. Ultimately, the last prison he served time in was Camp Asylum in Columbia, South Carolina, which would be the last place of imprisonment for Lieutenant Rockwell. So Lieutenant Rockwell was imprisoned at Camp Asylum in Columbia, South Carolina with officers from throughout the Union forces, not just Army of the Potomac. At this point, they had pulled in, officers from all over, from the Western Theater, from various battles and units and things. They had all wound up there. And while at Asylum, they were pretty isolated. They didn't have much contact. They were inside the, as a stockade. Not much news came in and out. But in late 1864, late in December, in fact, a black man who was probably enslaved and forced to work with the Confederates, who was sympathetic with the Union men, managed to sneak in to Camp Asylum in a loaf of bread a small newspaper clipping that had been folded up, and it refers to it being smaller than the size of a thimble. And it was baked into the bread. This African-American man brought it in to get this news to the soldiers that General Sherman had marched from Atlanta to the Atlantic Ocean, the famous March to the Sea. At that point, I don't think it was known as the March to the Sea, and part of it becoming known as the March to the Sea specifically has to do with Justus Rockwell. And when they got the news, December 23rd or 24th of 1864, via the newspaper packed into a loaf of bread, that was the news of Sherman marching. Another officer, Samuel Byers of the 5th, who was an adjutant of the 5th Iowa Infantry, who was there in their sort of jubilation, he decided to write a poem about Sherman's March to the Sea. And after reading it, Lieutenant Rockwell, who was before the war a musician and a songwriter and very active with the prison glee club, they called it, and he had a fife that he played in the band. He actually wrote music to accompany the lyrics that Lieutenant Byers had written to this song. and they performed it together. There was the first performance of the song Sherman's March to the Sea with Lieutenant Byers' lyrics, and Justus Rockwell's music was first sung by the Prison Glee Club on Christmas morning of 1864, birthing this song, which would go on to become one of the most famous and most well-known songs produced during the Civil War. It was written during the war. On Christmas morning, they performed the song. Justus Rockwell had spent the night, Christmas Eve night, writing the notes, writing out the actual tune of the song on a little piece of paper that he had kind of squirreled away some point in his imprisonment. And he writes of being in Christmas Eve night, of having to get up with his pencil and shake his hands and you know, keep himself warm so his fingers wouldn't go numb, so he could finish writing the piece of music, because there was so much enthusiasm among the soldiers to get it done and get it performed. So after they performed the song and the soldiers loved it, soon thereafter, one of the officers was exchanged out of the prison. And this is another Iowa officer who had lost a leg at the Battle of Champion Hill in May of 1863. He had a prosthetic, a fake wooden leg, and they took Justus Rockwell's tune and Lieutenant Byers' lyrics, and they rolled them up and they put it in the wooden leg, and they got it out of the prison. And from there it was sort of birthed. You know, it went viral, as we would say now, in that the song, it reached General Sherman himself. It went north. It was published in the year or two following the war. The sheet music to the song by Byers and Rockwell sold more than 1 million copies of the music of the song. And it went on to become an extremely iconic piece of music among that generation. Now we know Battle Hymn of the Republic, Johnny Comes Marching Home, songs like that. Those tunes are more familiar to us. But for someone in the 1880s, 1870s, 1890s, this would have been an extremely popular song, and probably where the phrase "March to the Sea," Sherman's March to the Sea, really took hold, was probably from this piece of music. So following the war and the success of the song, Lieutenant Rockwell moved to Pennsylvania for a time. He moved to Missouri for a time, and then around 1900 he eventually wound up here in Seattle. In Seattle, he had a pretty average life. He was a little bit older when he got here. He was married, and he had a couple different wives that had passed away, and he remarried here in Seattle. He was not involved heavily in the GAR command structure, but he was a very, very, very well-known JR figure. So he would have known and been known to every soldier in the cemetery, probably. He was extremely active in the events, in Republican politics. He wrote to the newspaper. He wrote into the veterans publications. He was extremely active, well-known, popular guy, partly because of the song, but partially because of just who he was. So Justus Rockwell would have been a well-known name among Americans in the decades after the war because of the song, and here in Seattle, he would have just been one of the most well-known Civil War veterans the city had at the time. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed hearing about Lieutenant Rockwell and his interesting military and music history and his impact as one of Seattle's most famous Civil War veterans in his lifetime.